So thank you very much, everyone, for coming to this talk. I'll just introduce the talk very briefly, but I'm really grateful to Andrew for his keynote. He set the scene really well, because what I'm going to talk about in the next half hour or so is very practical focused, but we're going to look at identifying threat actor infrastructure, but we're going to look particularly at the Russian threat, and we're going to focus very narrowly on how they set up and run their disinformation operations. So I'll introduce myself very briefly. So as you just saw, I'm a certified SANS instructor. I teach SEC 497, which is the introductory OSINT class. I also teach SEC 587, the advanced open source intelligence class. Away from SANS, I work for an organization called Protection Group International, PGI. We are a digital threats and intelligence company. And I spent a lot of time in the past couple of years looking at how nation states use the internet in a malicious way to attack our societies and our states. So just let me go back one. This is what I'm going to talk about today. So it's always a little bit tricky with these conferences because some of you, this might be the first time you've ever been to an OSINT conference, and you may be very early in your career. Others of you have been doing this for a very, very long time and are very technically skilled. So there'll be something for everyone in this talk. We're going to look at practical examples. So one of the reasons I chose this topic is because when I teach classes or I give talks to different places, one of the topics that always comes up on the student wish list is they usually want to get better at infrastructure investigations. So by that, I mean things like investigating websites, domains, attributing them, and so on. And security certificates, SSL certificates, is a really good place to start doing that. So we're going to look at 3 case studies. And as we go along, we'll increase the complexity of what we can do. But security certificates are a hugely underutilized resource for OSINT investigators. So hopefully over the next half hour, we will begin to understand a little bit more about how we can use them. Of course, if you have any questions, just fire them into the Slack and I'll pick them up at the end of the talk. So from the very beginning, what is an SSL certificate? Why do I care? What does it matter? So security certificates verify the identity of a website. So when I connect to sans.org, my browser needs to know that I really am connecting to sans.org and not some spoof or some kind of imitation website. And security certificates also allow me to make an encrypted connection to that website, so my data is safe. Now, every single security certificate or SSL certificate, they're unique, and every single one of them is made public in a public ledger, on a public ledger. We call them security certificate transparency logs. So every single website that has ever existed, even if it's been used for something malicious, well, maybe not that's ever existed, but certainly in the modern era, it doesn't matter if the website is malicious. It doesn't matter if it's being used for fraud or for phishing. It needs to have a security certificate. And if it has a security certificate, it has to be made public. And that means that we as OSINT practitioners have this huge resource of millions and millions and millions of security certificates that we can search through to map infrastructure, to identify malicious behavior. It's a very, very underused resource, so hopefully we'll shed some light on it in the next half hour. Other great things about security certificates as a data resource is not only are they all made public, but once you have issued a security certificate, doesn't matter how malicious you are as a threat actor, it's out there, it's public. You can't alter what's been put out there. So you can revoke a security certificate or you can issue a new one. But once you put it out there, as you'll see in our first case study, you can't wind it back in. Once it's been published, you can't see that. So what we have available to us is this huge repository of public information about websites, infrastructure that is freely available, and it's also a very high quality resource. So we're going to look at how to exploit this, and we're going to focus specifically on Russian disinformation operations that have targeted the US and the UK and Europe in the last year or so. So, so here's our first point. why security certificates are useful. They're really useful for attribution. Why are they useful for attribution? Well, if I own a domain, so if I own sans.org, I have to prove that I own that domain before I can obtain a security certificate for it. So I can't, if I wanted to imitate gmail.com, for example, I can't just go, Stephen Harris, can't just go and get a security certificate for gmail.com. I have to prove, usually through some kind of cryptographic test, that I actually own that domain. So if someone obtains a security certificate for a domain, they have to have proved that they own it. So very strong attribution. There's a very strong connection. Not anyone can just obtain a security certificate. But supposing that I have multiple domains that I own because I'm running a campaign that involves many, many domains, many different websites. One option I have is to obtain what we call a subject alternative name, or a SANS certificate. Nothing to do with SANS, just coincidence. It's a subject alternative name. So if I own lots of domains, I can just roll them all into one certificate. I don't have to do that, but it does make life a little bit easier, perhaps. So what that means for us as practitioners is when we're looking at security certificates, and I'll show you some examples of this in just a moment, but when we're looking at these security certificates, if we see lots of domains that all share the same certificate, there is a very, very high likelihood that those domains are owned and controlled by the same person, because they have to have proved ownership of all of those domains. Very important, as we'll see in our first case study. So the first example is a website which came online late in 2022. It's since gone offline. It was called dcweekly.org. And it claimed to be a newspaper website based here in Washington, D.C. And it published lots of news that was very pro-Russian, very critical of the United States, and it was used to leak sensational stories about US politicians. The overall aim of the website was to convince US audiences, or people who in other parts of the world who read US media, that certain things about US politicians and the US government were not true. So it presented the US in a very negative light and presented Russia in a very, very positive light. And so dcweekly.org, some investigative journalists dug into it, and they identified, I think originally from an old Whois record, I think, that it was likely linked to a guy called John Mark Dugan. John Dugan was a sheriff's deputy who lived in Florida originally. And in 2016, he fell out with his employers in the police department where he worked in Florida, and he set up a series of fake news websites to publish defamatory information about other law enforcement officers, about judges in Florida, and so on. Now, if you work in law enforcement, you know that's going to end very badly for you if you do that kind of thing. And just before he could be prosecuted, he fled to Russia to avoid prosecution in the United States, and he's still based there. So journalists said, hey, this DC Weekly website that's publishing all this information about the US government, all the Russian disinformation, we think it's yours, John Dugan. He said no. He obviously clearly denied it. But if we dig into the security certificates that he obtained for dcweekly.org, we can see there's an overlap between his domain dcweekly.org and some others as well. Remember, security certificates, you have to prove ownership of a domain, and once you've published it, you can't go back and change. You can't take away what has already been made public through the certificate transparency logs. So we can go to a website called crt.sh, and we can look at every single security certificate that has ever been issued for dcweekly.org. And if we go back to the very early days of the website, we could see that when he obtained a certificate, or the owner of DC Weekly obtained a certificate, he obtained one for dcweekly.org. The same certificate also covered Clear Story News, which is another disinformation website, and it also covered another subdomain on another website called Falcon Eye Tech. All these websites have unfortunately, or fortunately, now gone offline. But what that record there shows us is that the same person owned or controlled all of these websites. And when we went to the falconi.tech website, you could see it was the personal business website of John Dugan. He ran, even though he was based in Russia, he was offering sort of remote security monitoring services for people in Florida, where he used to work. But what that record tells us is that all three of those domains are all owned and controlled by the same person. So his claim that this is nothing to do with me, well, actually the security certificate records show that if you own falconi.tech, which is openly your own personal security business, you also must own and control dcweekly.org as well. So whois records don't help you out with this kind of thing. Hosting history doesn't help you with this kind of thing, but that you can't lie to obtain a security certificate. So it provides a very strong signal that the same person is linked to this, to all this whole collection of different websites. Another really useful example of how we can use security certificates is to find hidden infrastructure. By hidden infrastructure, I mean infrastructure that is still an essential part of an organization's online footprint, but perhaps is not designed to be accessible to the public. So it might be areas for internal administration and so on. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing anything wrong or anything suspicious. But if I own a very large organization and I have lots of different parts to my company's domain, I probably need to obtain security certificates separately for different parts of that infrastructure. So one of the very useful things that security certificates do is they help us to map the subdomains of an organization's sort of main website, their main domain, and we get a much bigger picture of what their online infrastructure looks like. And very often, threat actors make mistakes they reveal things in their subdomains that aren't obvious any other way. And I'm going to show you now an example of a Russian state-run media operation that exposed itself in this way. So the backstory. So after Russia invaded Ukraine, which is 3 years ago today, as we heard this morning, a lot of Russian state media organizations were sanctioned, and they were banned from Western social media platforms. And a lot of their websites became inaccessible in other parts of the world, which was a problem for Russia, because to try and steer the world towards their point of view, they seek to dominate the information space, so push out Western media and inject their own narratives, their own claims into that space. And they use their state media assets in order to do that. So this was a bit of a blow to Russia when sites like Russia or rt.com and others were no longer accessible in the West. So one of the ways they tried to adapt to this was they would try and set up new brands, new domains to try and disguise their state-run operations. They didn't give up. The ban didn't stop them. They just had to rebrand themselves, and they set up quite a few new brands, new domains, new websites in order to try and do that. Now, the internet has rules. One of those rules you have to follow is if you want to set up a website, you must have a security certificate. Because if you don't, people's browsers will not trust the website, and they won't be able to visit it. They'll just get a warning in their browser. The other thing that will happen is if you don't have a valid security certificate, Google and other search engines will de-rank you in their search listings. So you need to have a security certificate. Doesn't matter if you're a nation state trying to hide your operations, you still got to have one. So in June 2023, this new website popped up, and it had various other social media assets on various platforms called viori.video, brand new enterprise. And it didn't say it was part of the Russian state. It didn't admit that it had any links to previous known Russian state media operations. But they set up this website, and it's used to push video content that tends to support Russian messaging, not in the West so much, but in other parts of the world in the global South. So we want to investigate this website and say, well, where did it come from? It's very well resourced. It's pushing Russian propaganda. How can we dig into it? One of the first things we can do, we can go to crt.sh, and look at the history of every single security certificate ever issued for that website or for that domain, add any of the subdomains. Little side note here, where security certificates, so hard to say that word, where they're also useful, they will tell you when a website first went online as well, or at least give you a rough indication. We can see the very first security certificate for this particular domain was set up in June 2023. Now, looking through the security certificate history, we're not interested so much in the main domain, but in February last year, so in fact 1 year ago, this new subdomain popped up called ruelection2024.viori.video. Now, the Russians have elections of a kind, and they had one to essentially re-elect President Putin this time last year. And this subdomain popped up. Now, this is super interesting to me because if you Google for that term, ruelection2024.viori.video, you won't find it indexed in any search engine. It's not linked to internally from the Viori website. The only way, that, as far as I know, to have discovered this particular subdomain was through looking at the certificate history. So being nosy, went to visit this particular website, which I think is still there. And it offers front row views for the announcement of the results of the Russian election. So you could pay 450 euros. That gives you a front row seat for the announcement of the Russian election results. You can have a fully equipped and staffed live stand-up position overlooking Red Square for when they re-announce the election of President Putin. They also offer to facilitate direct interviews with Russian politicians and government officials. Now, put your analyst hat on for a moment and think on balance of probabilities making your decisions. How likely is it that this Viori, who are offering these services, are linked to the Russian state, based on what this information, the indicators, like if this was a genuine independent new media brand, very, very unlikely that they would be able to offer direct access to Russian politicians. So this was a big red flag to me and helped me, I thought from this, well, it does tend to support the idea that Viori is a disguised new, it's the same old Russian state media under a new brand to beat sanctions and to beat platform evasion. There's something else we can do with the security certificates as well and look at some of their other subdomains. So I went back to crt.sh and looked for some of the other certificates they'd obtained. And I noticed they have this really strange way of naming their subdomains. So you see here, they're all like a cdn2, enc4, cdn2, enc3.viori.video, and so on and so on and so on. Well, okay, admins make their own decisions about how they name their infrastructure. But I thought this is kind of weird. Do any other organizations use this same weird subdomain format? So I went to Security Trails, which has huge historic records of DNS records. And I did a wildcard search for this same term, CD2ENC. And guess what? In the whole history of DNS records, covering the entire history of the internet, going back to the early part of this century, only 2 organizations in the entire history of the internet use that same naming format for their subdomains. One was Viori Video, this new suspicious Russian media operation. The other organization was one called Ruptly. Now, Ruptly.tv is overtly a Russian state media operation. They were sanctioned by the US in September last year. But Ruptly and Viori are the only 2 organizations in the entire world ever that use that same subdomain naming format, which is a very strong link that we can find through the certificates. They also, guess what? These CDN subdomains also share the same single IP address. So thinking about your attribution, we thought they're likely to be linked to the Russian state because they were facilitating interviews with Russian politicians. They're also sharing the exact same internet infrastructure as a known Russian state media entity as well. And then we dig into the people and we find this very convenient behavior where we go on LinkedIn, and a lot of people who used to work for Ruptly suddenly now find themselves, they're now employees of Viori Video based in Dubai. So on the balance of probabilities, yeah, highly likely that Viori is one of these disguised subversive Russian state media brands that allows them, even when they've shut down on one platform, to rebrand themselves and move to others to continue their propaganda operations. Take away from this, we would not have been able to discover this information through Googling. We wouldn't have been able to discover it through examining the website. The security certificates, that's the resource that points us to all these other parts of the infrastructure that allow us to make these connections. So Ruptly and most of the other main Russian Russian state media brands were sanctioned by the US last year. Viori somehow missed the chop. So it hasn't been sanctioned, but we can see very clearly that the certificates don't lie. Okay, the final section now, something a little bit more complicated, something a little bit more novel from some research I did earlier this year, which is a completely different use of security certificates. And this is to find the real IP address of a threat actor website that hides behind Cloudflare. Now, if you've done website investigations for any time period before, you will have inevitably sometimes come up against Cloudflare. And for the record, I'm a big fan of Cloudflare. They do some fantastic stuff to help protect websites from things like DDoS and so on. But for investigators, Cloudflare can be very, very frustrating, because when you want to know where a particular website is hosted, you try and visit it, and you'll look at the DNS records, and it'll just say Cloudflare, Cloudflare, Cloudflare. Very, very difficult to know where a website behind Cloudflare is really hosted. And there are a few techniques for dealing with that that I've covered in Sans talks previously. But this is a new method that I tried earlier this year, and it served me very well. So a little bit the theory, first of all. So if you set up a website, so if I'm a threat actor and I want to set up my propaganda website to influence an election, for example, I set up my website here on the origin server, so the real IP address, the real server, the origin server, and I connect to Cloudflare's infrastructure, somewhere here in the middle, and then any users who come to visit my website, they'd never connect to my origin server. They will only ever connect to Cloudflare. So they don't ever see the real IP address, and they don't ever connect directly to the original website. They just connect to Cloudflare's edge, which works very well. It's just frustrating as an investigator. So what that means very often is if I want to investigate a website that uses Cloudflare, and I want to look at their security certificates, what I'm actually going to see when I look at crt.sh or when I visit the website and inspect the certificate directly, I'm going to see the security certificate not on an origin server, but I'm going to see Cloudflare's certificate, which can make it very hard. But what Cloudflare also recommend when you set up your website is that you also obtain a separate security certificate for your origin server to encrypt the connection between your server and Cloudflare. You don't have to do that, but it's recommended, and most sites do. So bear with me on this one. But what that means is, if somehow I can find the origin server security certificate, I can verify the real IP address of the website where that is. Small problem, there are 4.3 billion possible IP version 4 addresses, even if we remove some of those. But I kind of like that as an investigator, because it means that our subject is cornered. They've got nowhere else to go. There's only 4.3 billion possibilities. Like they've got to be there somewhere, right? They are there somewhere, and eventually we'll find, like a needle in a haystack, we'll find the right one. I'll explain how a little bit more. But I'm just going to cover how this technology works very, very briefly. So when you connect to a website, you put the address bar so you put the address in your browser bar, hit enter. Very, very quickly, your browser performs something called a TLS handshake. It establishes an encrypted connection between your browser and that server. It only takes a fraction of a second. You don't even notice it. But that TLS handshake takes place before any traffic goes back and forth between your browser and the machine. Which that kind of works okay, but then we have another problem. When I connect to a server, there might be 5 different websites on that particular server. There might be 1,000, there might be 10,000. So when my browser connects to a server at a given IP address, how does it make sure that I may perform an encrypted connection with the right domain? Because there's thousands to choose from. How do I actually do that? And the way the internet handles this problem is through something called server name indication. I'll show you how that works and how we can exploit that in just a moment. So server name indication works something like this. So there's a server somewhere which has 3 websites on it. It has example.com, it has test.com, and it has company.com. So when I connect to that server, how do I make sure that I form an encrypted connection with the right one? Well, server name indication means when my browser tries to establish that encrypted connection, it will name the domain that it wants a certificate for. So when I connect to this server here, if I want to connect to example.com, my browser will specify in example.com as the domain that it wants to connect to. And then if there is a valid certificate for example.com on that server, the server will complete the connection and we connect to the website. If that certificate is not there, it will say, and it will just say, I haven't got a certificate for example.com, and it will just present me with a certificate for the default domain, if there is one. So we can think of this as essentially knocking on lots of different doors, asking if someone is at home. So if I want to visit Matt, for example, and I don't know where he lives, I could knock on the door of every single house in his neighborhood, say, is Matt there? No. Is Matt there? No. Is Matt there? No. But if Matt is there, eventually I'll find one house where he opens the door and I find him. So that's how TLS works, and this is how we can take advantage of it. So there is a very complex, well-established, very well-resourced Russian disinformation operation called, we refer to it as the Pravda network. It's a vast network of websites that target pretty much every single country in the world, but their English language operation is called Pravda-EN. They target the UK and the US. And I want to know where this is really hosted. I suspect it's Russian because of the content, but following on from what Andrew said this morning, we want to be good at attribution. We want to try and show our working, not just guess. So we want to try and establish where this website is really hosted. Problem with that? Cloudflare. They use Cloudflare, so we can't easily find their real IP address of the website. Bit of a problem. So to go back to my theory, finding a needle in a haystack, I know somewhere on one of the world's 4.3 billion IP version 4 addresses, one of those IP addresses, the Pravda website is there. Don't know which one, but I can have a guess, but I can find it eventually, give it enough time. Because finding a needle in a haystack is actually pretty easy. If you were looking at me thinking, what cause it's not easy? Well, if you have a huge haystack of 4.3 billion bits of hay and one needle, you would find it eventually if you removed every single bit of hay, you would eventually be left with a needle. Very boring, very time consuming, but conceptually not too tricky. So I thought if I can perform a TLS handshake with millions of different servers, and I ask for the domain pravda.en.com, eventually I will be wrong every single time until eventually the origin server will present itself to me when I perform a TLS handshake. So I thought, well, that's kind of fun as an idea. How could I actually do this? So the great thing is there is a free tool available called zgrab2. If any of you have ever used Census, it's the same family of tools that they use to map the internet at scale. And zgrab2, you can provide it with a range of IP addresses, and it will go and perform a TLS handshake for you and announce the results to you. So I said that you could use zgrab2 to connect to every single possible IP address for the domain you're looking from. I don't recommend that you go for the whole world's 4.3 billion addresses all at once. You have to think a little bit smart. So if you know, for example, that a threat actor always likes to use the same hosting provider, you can narrow the range down to just a few million IP addresses. Or if they have other infrastructure that you think is probably part of the same operation, you can start there rather than going for the whole internet at once. Now, Pravda, obviously, I assumed it was Russian. So I grabbed the IP ranges of different Russian hosting providers via a site from bgp.io, and I tested this concept out. To give you an idea of how long this takes, to scan one of the ASNs was about 2.5 million IP addresses. That took about 2 hours to scan that. So it's very, very quick. And I can grep through the results very quickly and see if I got a match or not. So it does, doing the whole internet would take a few days, but actually that's not that long a time in the scale of things. So this is how I ran zgrab. So this is the command. You run zgrab on a server. Don't run this from your own machine. But you can run zgrab on a virtual server somewhere. And I tried a few different Russian hosting providers, and I got no matches back. But there was one of the smaller hosting providers, a company called Logol, very, very small Russian hosting provider. Their whole IP range is only about 7,000 different IP addresses, so very, very small as far as a hosting provider goes. And the command I ran went something like this. So I run zgrab2 in TLS mode, so it's going to do that handshake. I give it the input file, which is the list of IP addresses or IP ranges that they use. The output file, which is going to be my results, JSON. And then this option here, server name, pravdaen.com. That's the SNI part of the handshake. So I'm asking every single IP address in that range to say, have you got a certificate for this domain? And of course, no, 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 yes. And eventually, after only a few minutes, because this was a very small number of IP addresses, this IP address here, 178.21.15.85, comes back and says, hey, yes, I do have a certificate for pravdaen.com on my server. And of course, this shows to me then that this is the origin server. This is not the Cloudflare certificate. This is not the Cloudflare IP address. I've been able to connect eventually, after a lot of trial and error, to another IP address and grab the origin certificate from that particular IP address. So now very confident that I found where this infrastructure is, and I'm going to be able to attribute this site not only based on the content, but also based on the infrastructure as well. Now, because we want to be diligent OSINT investigators, we don't just want to guess, we want to verify and test that our findings are accurate. You can reproduce this process on a per server basis using a tool called sslyze, which is it's a Python tool. If you've used Kali Linux, it's already built into Kali. But I can reproduce this process using the command that you see there by connecting directly to the IP address. You can see I specified it in the command there, then using the SNI option for the domain that I actually want. If that domain is there, it will present me with a genuine certificate for that domain. It did in this case. You can see the copy of it there. You see the SHA-1 fingerprint of the certificate. I can compare this to certificate transparency logs, and I know then that I've got the right one, and I found it, and then I'm able to verify it, and then I'm able to put into my report that yes, this Russian content website is definitely hosted at this IP address, and that's all through ultimately through taking advantage of the way security certificate works. Okay, well that's pretty much the end of my time. So if you have any questions about what we covered, or you want to discuss the techniques in any more depth, please post a question in the Slack and I'll answer them. I know there'll be a question about, don't you get caught when you blast thousands of IP addresses at once? The answer for that is no, very often, because most web servers are not checking for failed TLS handshakes is a short answer. I can discuss that with you in more depth. And tomorrow, I'll be running a workshop where we'll dive into way more depth into some other techniques for looking for these kind of websites. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you.